You wake up and your legs will not move. Not numb. Not asleep. Gone. Your arms answer only halfway, and your neck is locked in place like a door that has swallowed its own hinge. You are 19 years old. There is no hospital. No wheelchair. No antibiotic. So, how long do you last? For most of the last 300,000 years, the answer should be days. A body that cannot walk cannot follow the herd. A mouth that cannot feed itself competes with mouths that can. That is the cold arithmetic of survival, and almost every documentary you have ever watched has quietly trained you to accept it as obvious. The bones disagree. They disagree so loudly that it changes what you think a human being actually is. In northern Vietnam, there is a Neolithic burial ground called Man Back. It is roughly 4,000 years old. In it, archaeologists Lorna Tilley and Mark Oxenham found a grave they simply labeled Burial 9. Inside was a young man who died in his early 20s. His spine told the whole story. He had a condition we now call Klippel-Feil syndrome, which means several of the bones in his neck had fused into one solid block. Plain English version. His neck could not turn, his legs were paralyzed, and his arms had almost no strength left. He had been like that since he was a teenager, and he lived that way for about 10 more years. Sit with that number for a second. 10 years without the ability to stand. 10 years in a tropical climate, where an unwashed body develops open pressure sores in weeks, and those sores turn septic fast. 10 years of somebody rolling him over, feeding him, cleaning him, carrying him. When the group moved, that is not a kind gesture. That is thousands of hours of physical labor given by people who had no surplus, no soap, no painkillers, and no obligation. So why did they do it? Hold that question, because Man Back is not an isolated case. It is a pattern that shows up on almost every continent, in almost every era, going back further than our own species. Go to Iraq, to a cave called Shanidar in the Zagros Mountains. In 1957, the archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who died around 45,000 years ago. The diggers nicknamed him Nandy. His injury list reads like a car crash report. His right arm was withered and useless below the elbow, likely lost entirely. The left side of his face had been crushed by a heavy blow, almost certainly destroying the sight in that eye. He had a healed fracture on his skull, arthritis in his leg, and a limp severe enough to be visible in the bone. In 2017, Eric Trinkhaus and Sebastian Velote examined tiny bony growths inside his ear canals and concluded something even harder. He was probably deaf. Now, picture that combination in an Ice Age landscape. One arm, one eye, a limp, no hearing. In a world of hyenas, cave lions, and sudden weather, this man could not hunt, could not run, and could not hear a predator approaching from behind. He lived into his 40s. He was old by Neanderthal standards. Somebody kept him alive for decades. In southern Italy, there is a rock shelter called Rometo. About 11,000 years ago, a teenager was buried there, who the anthropologist David Freyer studied in detail. The boy had a form of dwarfism that left his arms extremely short and his body low to the ground. On the steep mountain terrain around that shelter, he simply could not have kept up with a hunting party. He was buried carefully, held against a woman, under a slab of engraved stone. In Florida, at a waterlogged site called Windover, there is a boy of about 15 who was born with spina bifida, a condition where the spine does not close properly around the nerves. He could not walk without help. He lived to 15 anyway, 7,000 years ago, in a swamp. And if you go back much further, to a site called Dmanisi in the country of Georgia, David Lord Kipanidze and his team found a skull that is roughly 1.77 million years old. The jaw has almost no teeth left, and the sockets had healed over completely, which means the teeth were lost years before death. An early human ancestor with no teeth, in a world of raw meat and tough plants, surviving long enough for the bone to smooth over. Somebody was processing his food. That is not sentiment. That is a fact written in mineral. So, this instinct is not modern. It is not Christian, or Buddhist, or civilized. It is older than our species. Here is where it gets stranger, because they were not only feeding the sick, they were treating them. In a Spanish cave called El Sidrón, a group of Neanderthals died around 49,000 years ago. The researcher Karen Hardy analyzed the hardened plaque on their teeth, which traps microscopic evidence of everything that passed through the mouth. She found chamomile and yarrow. Both are bitter. Both are nutritionally useless. You do not eat them by accident, and you do not eat them for calories. Later, in 2017, Laura Wyrick and her team pushed the analysis further and published the results in Nature. One young El Cidron male had a painful dental abscess and an intestinal parasite that would have given him serious diarrhea. In his plaque, they found poplar, a tree bark containing salicylic acid. That is the active chemical family behind aspirin. They also found traces of Penicillium mold, the same genus that gave us penicillin. Does that mean Neanderthals understood microbiology? Of course not. And anyone who tells you that is selling something. But it does mean a sick individual was consuming exactly the two things that would have eased his pain and fought his infection, while healthy individuals in the same cave were not. Somebody noticed he was suffering. Somebody brought him something. Then there is Otzi, the Iceman frozen in the Alps about 5,300 years ago. His gut was full of whipworm, a parasite that causes cramps and bloody stools. In his kit, he carried birch polypore, a fungus with compounds that are toxic to exactly that kind of worm. He was carrying his own medicine when he died. So let us reconstruct one ordinary day around all of this evidence. It is a cold morning, and the group is moving to a new camp. You are the one who cannot walk. Two people lift you onto a frame of branches and hide. Your shoulders scrape. It hurts. Nobody stops. At midday, a woman chews tough roots into a soft paste because your jaw cannot manage them, and she feeds you with her fingers. In the afternoon, someone rolls you onto your other side to keep the skin on your back from breaking open, and packs damp leaves against the sore that is already there. At night, they set you nearest the fire, because you cannot shiver yourself warm the way they can. You contribute nothing. No meat, no firewood, no distance covered, and nobody suggests leaving you. Why? Here is the part that most people get wrong, and it is the reason this story matters. This was not charity. Charity is what you give from a surplus, and hunter-gatherers rarely had one. The anthropologist Richard Lee spent the 1960s living with the Juhanzi people in the Kalahari, carefully weighing what they ate and recording who gave what to whom. The meat from a kill did not belong to the hunter. It was distributed across the whole camp by rules the hunter did not control. And boasting about your own kill was actively mocked. Polly Wisner documented something even smarter in the same region. An exchange system called HXARO, where people deliberately built long-distance gift partnerships with families in other bands. Those partnerships looked like generosity. They were insurance. When your waterhole dried up, you had a name and an obligation waiting 60 kilometers away. James Suzman, who spent decades with the same communities, describes a whole economy built on the assumption that today's luck is temporary. And that is exactly the logic behind caring for the sick. Every single hunter is one bad step from a broken ankle. Every mother is one difficult birth from being helpless for a month. A group that abandons the weak is a group where every strong member knows what happens to them the moment their body fails. So the care was not soft. It was structural. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire society. Now the twist that almost nobody expects. You would assume that as humans settled down, built villages, and invented farming, sickness got easier to handle. It got dramatically worse. Settled life meant living beside animals, beside your own waste, and beside hundreds of other people in a fixed spot. That is the origin of the crowd diseases. Measles, tuberculosis, influenza, smallpox. Skeletal studies across the transition to agriculture keep showing the same grim signature. Shorter bodies, worse teeth, more bone lesions from infection and malnutrition. Your ancestors traded a diet of variety and a body of movement for a diet of grain and a life of repetition, and their bones recorded the bill. And something quieter changed too. When survival came from a shared band, your illness was the group's problem. When survival came from your own field, your own grain store, your own household, your illness became your family's private burden. Care did not disappear. It just got smaller and lonelier. Which brings this back to you. You live in the most medically capable moment in human history. You can survive infections that would have erased entire Ice Age families in a week. That is real, and it is worth being grateful for. But notice what modern medicine actually solved. It solved the biology of being sick. It never solved the other half. Run a fever alone in an apartment tonight, and you will find out how much of that other half still matters. Nobody sits with you. Nobody notices. You order food to your own door. A Neanderthal with one eye and one arm had more people paying attention to his suffering than most people in a modern city do. And if being cared for was the thing that kept your species alive for 300,000 years, then the loneliness you feel when you are ill is not weakness. It is an ancient alarm going off correctly in a body that expects a camp. So ask yourself who your H-Zorro partners are, not your contacts, not your followers, the actual names who would show up. Because the technology changed completely and the requirement did not change at all. You wake up and your legs will not move. The thing that decides what happens next was never the medicine. It was whether anyone was still there when you called.